this final webinar in the American History series of NAS. So, well, welcome everybody to this final event in National Association of Scholars webinar series, American History, American Character. Today, the topic is going to be Celebrating America, Our History and Our Future. My name's Keith Whitaker. I'm the chairman of the board of NAS, and I'll be moderating today's event. In just a moment, you're going to hear from our panelists, but first I want to give you an idea of what to expect from today's event. So I'm going to first introduce our three panelists and say a few words myself. Then each of them are going to have 15 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I'll read questions from you, the audience, to our speakers. So please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the event. In fact, one question we have, Chance, is, can you allow closed captions? I don't know if that's possible technologically, but maybe you can look into that. So please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. And if your questions don't get answered, you can email them to contact@nas.org, and I'll make sure they get to the panelists after the event. Now, this event is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent to the email address with which you used to register for the event. Now, before we begin, I want to thank the staff at NAS for organizing the series, in particular, Chance Layton, Chris Kendall, and of course, David Randall, who helped conceive this project and moderated many of the prior 28 webinars. If you haven't seen all 28, you can find them on YouTube at NAS's channel. Also, many, many thanks to the Bradley Foundation for sponsoring this entire important series. So now let me introduce our speakers for today. So we have Dr. Steve Balch, who is the founding president of the National Association of Scholars and has served as the director of Texas Tech's Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. We have Dr. Bill Mcclay, the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Center for the History of Liberty. And third, Dr. Paul Ray, professor of history and the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in the Western Heritage, at Hillsdale College. Now, before we go to Dr. Balch to share his thoughts, I'm going to speak ex cathedra and add my 2 cents about American character. And to help me do so, I'm going to use one of the most influential books from our history, Benjamin Franklin's The Way to Wealth. Now, in that little book, Franklin, under the guise of a certain Father Abraham, extols 3 practices: industry, care, and frugality. And frugality gets by far the most attention. And within that section of the book, Father Abraham quotes this line from Franklin's alter ego, Poor Richard. He quotes, "A plowman on his legs is higher than a gentleman on his knees." Now, it strikes me that this character, this habit, defines much of American history. The refusal to kneel, whether to king or established church, to the few rich or the many poor, to unthinking tradition or to fiery revolutionaries, and to all those who claim to know what's best for us better than we know ourselves. This character of refusing to kneel recoils in revulsion at slavery and at tyranny. It has won world wars and propelled scientific inquiry. It has led to much good and to occasional embarrassments. I think, too, that this character helps explain the growing disaffection felt by many in this country at present towards our would-be elite, who always seem to be, quote, taking a knee, whether to Black Lives Matter and anti-racist grifters, to Antifa and mostly peaceful protesters, to old Dr. Fauci and the new Ministry of Truth, to the blue checks of Twitter and the media mandarins, to communists and kleptocrats, to the so-called settled science of COVID or climate change or transgenderism. And of course, I have to add to all those who manufacture consent and patrol responsible speech in our colleges and universities. No matter how inconsistent, incompetent, and unaccountable these objects of reverence may be, our ungentle gentlemen seem in a state of almost perpetual proskynesis towards them. Still, the evident and growing disgust with which many Americans hold these witlings and fribbles give me some hope that the upright posture may continue to define the American spirit, not only in the present, but into the future. Now then, without further ado, let's go on to Dr. Balch, then Professor Mcclay, and then Professor Ray. So as each of you finish your 15 minutes, the next speaker may begin. And when Professor Ray is done, I'll return to moderate the Q&A. And so as a reminder to those of you in the audience, please share your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will plan to conclude by 3:30 Eastern Time. So Steve, on to you.
Well, I want to talk about the Republican idea as the basis for American civic life, and specifically the notion of a republic based on civic equality and repudiation of caste. There had been republics in the world before our republic came along, but our republic was something special in that it declared itself on the basis of a rather explicit philosophy, which earlier republics hadn't done. And that explicit philosophy, which was embodied in our Constitution, was that we were going to be, in a loose sense at least, a republic of equals, not an oligarchic republic as most of the earlier republics had been, but a republic in which citizenship was open to all. And that virtue, that ideal, I think was very exemplified in the life of one of the country's really unsung heroes, a man who not only talked the talk, as many others did in his time, but who walked the walk, a walk that took him from Virginia to Illinois and then back to Pennsylvania. His name was Edward Kohls. And again, it's not a name most people are familiar with, even those who are pretty well versed in American history. He was the son of a aristocratic Virginia family that owned a great deal of land in the state. It went back really to the founding of the colony. Owned many slaves, scores and scores and scores of slaves. Kohls was born into that, and he was born in 1786. Grew up being able to hobnob with the country's founders, who were still alive and well and very active in politics. His cousin was Dolly Madison, so he was connected to the Virginian elite by marriage, as well as by the very top rungs of the Virginian elite by marriage. As a young man, William and Mary, he conceived an abiding dislike, indeed a philosophic rejection, a profound philosophic rejection of slavery. He thought it was antithetical to the Republican ideal, the kind of ideal that I've just described, for very good reason. And he conceived of spending the rest of his civic life, his active civic life, in opposition to it. He also decided early on that if he received any slaves, as he expected to through inheritance, he was going to free them. There were some other people who had freed their slaves, but there weren't that many. There were barriers to freeing slaves by the time he became a young man in the state of Virginia. A freed slave had to leave the state. So there were real practical difficulties, hardships that would burden the slave when they were free, and he had to find a way around that. He became personal secretary to President James Madison. His brother Isaac had first gotten the job, but given the kind of rambunctious culture of the time, Isaac had an altercation with a member of Congress and beat him up. And in the ensuing scandal was forced to resign. So this opened the way for Edward to take his place. He spent several years in the employ of Madison. At one point, he was actually sent as a special emissary to the Tsar in order to clear up a problem that had arisen when the ambassador to the United States from Russia had been convicted of rape. So he discharged that mission successfully, came back, and having inherited 19 slaves, decided that the time had come to act. And after thinking of many options, he decided that what he would do would be to take the slaves off to the territory, which was about to become a state, of Illinois, and settle with them there. He had kept, he had a variety of earlier versions of this plan, but he had kept them from his family because he thought that if he let them know he intended to free his slaves at the point at which he acquired ownership, he would not receive any slaves. He'd be cut out of the will, or at least he'd receive non-slave property and wouldn't have the opportunity to free anyone. So he kept this as a secret. He kept it as a secret from the slaves themselves. He simply told them to essentially meet him in Pittsburgh. They were in Virginia. He was in the capital. A lot of folks thought he'd never see them again. He gave them the means, the funds to travel from Virginia to Pittsburgh, and his faith in them was fully realized when they showed up with all the property that he had given them to transport. They then embarked on a river journey down the Ohio, and as soon as they were well launched, he brought the slaves together. There were two large barges, and he told them what he intended to do. If you ever go to the capital of Illinois, you can actually see that scene. It's part of the mural complex in the capital. Edward Kohls telling his slaves that they were going to be free. And by the way, he didn't only intend to free them, he intended to give each family 160 acres of land gratis that he was going to purchase. So they were delighted to hear this. They arrived in Illinois. He had been in Illinois a few times before and actually had already established residence in Illinois. In one of the earlier trips, he had participated in the state convention to draft the first Illinois Constitution, which prohibited slavery, though there were some catches to that. Illinois was part of the Northwest Territory, the old Northwest Territory, and the Northwest Ordinance had prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, but it had grandfathered in the slaves who were already there, which dated back to French times. So there were slaves in the state, and there were a variety of other subterfuges whereby blacks could be brought into the state in a kind of indentured status, which was nearly the same as slavery. So slavery existed, even though the Constitution that he helped draft prohibited it. However, the slave forces in the state, and there were many people who had crossed into Illinois from Missouri, wanted to turn Illinois into a slave state. And that turned out to be the great fight of Edward Cohls's life. Kohls, after he arrived in the state in 1823, put himself forward as a candidate for governor, and in a divided field, and to his surprise, was elected governor of Illinois. His term commenced, I think, in 1824. And during that time, the proponents of slavery, the people who wanted to make the state slave, managed to pass over his opposition a resolution in the legislature calling on the citizens of the state to participate in a referendum. And had the referendum so decided, it would have called a new convention, which the pro-slave forces thought that they could control. And they would have used that to change the Constitution and make Illinois a slave state. Now, just imagine for a moment what the consequences would have been for the rest of American history had slavery rooted itself in Illinois. The entire political scene, the balance of power between slave and free forces, the career of Abraham Lincoln itself would have been profoundly affected, and obviously for the worse, by the success of that effort. So Kohls, as governor, took upon himself the leadership of the anti-slavery coalition. He dedicated the entirety, $4,000, of his gubernatorial salary to that effort. He used his friendships with Quaker circles in Pennsylvania and with Nicholas Biddle, who was by then the president of the Second Bank of the United States, to raise money, to have leaflets and pamphlets printed up. This was done surreptitiously, since a Pennsylvania connection would not have told well to the voters of Illinois. He traveled the state holding meetings. He was tireless. And when the vote finally came, the convention idea was defeated 58 to 42%. But it was largely due to Kohls' efforts. And with that, Kohls had not only set an example, an anti-slave example, but in fact had done something, if not decisive, at least very important with respect to the future of slavery in the United States. Kohls is also pretty well known for an exchange of letters between himself and Jefferson. This occurred while he was still the secretary to Madison. He asked Jefferson whether he would not now in his retirement, with nothing else to do presumably, lead a national effort to abolish slavery. And Jefferson, while agreeing that this would be a noble and worthy thing to do, demurred on the basis of his being too old. That is probably, if there's one thing that has left Kohls' mark in American history, certainly in the biographies of Jefferson, it's that letter exchange, which Kohls comes off much better than Jefferson did. Kohls, after leaving the governorship, he cared very much for the former slaves that he had settled. He oversaw their adjustment to a life of freedom, and most of them made that adjustment very successfully. He suffered the slings and arrows of his position. Politics then wasn't all that different from politics today, at least out on the frontier. He left the state once during his term to go to Pennsylvania, and the lieutenant governor, having taken over for 2 months, refused to give him the office back. He had to fight that out in the legislature. He was also sued by the pro-slavery people. It's a long, complicated suit. It had to do with the fact that he had not, in their view, in freeing his slaves, dotted every I and crossed every T. In fact, the law was on his side, but he faced a civil judgment of $20,000. He fought that successfully again. So there were many personal hardships. He ran for Congress in 1831, was defeated. He never really adjusted to the party system. He didn't think parties were proper in a republic. Again, a republic should be a matter of individual citizens maintaining the virtues and ideals of Republican equality. So he didn't like political parties. When he lost, he returned to Philadelphia. He lived there fairly comfortably. One of his sons, ironically and very sadly for him, returned to Virginia just before the Civil War, bought slave property, and then volunteered to fight for the Confederacy and was killed in the Battle of Roanoke Island in 1862. Kohls only met Lincoln once. He, of course, knew of him as a young politician, but he only met him once after Lincoln's election. He voted for Lincoln in Pennsylvania, and Lincoln came through on his tour before arriving in Washington, was feted and acclaimed. Kohls came to the event as a private citizen. He was part of a large throng, but people brought him up to Lincoln, and Lincoln congratulated him and told him that he was warmly remembered in the state. Kohls lived to see the Civil War completed. He died in 1868 at the age of 81, but by that time he was not well known. Even in Philadelphia, he received only a few lines in his obituary. But he is a great unsung hero of American republicanism. a man who was willing to kind of give up his entitlements, who could not stomach the idea of property in human beings and divested himself of it as soon as he practically could, and then who was the leader in now a little known but terribly important battle to keep slavery from expanding northward as well as westward into Illinois, and is largely responsible for defeating that. So in thinking about how Americans should carry their citizenship today, at a time when our problems are different, but I think still as serious as they were back in Kohls' time, and in a period today when politics has become as no holds barred as they were in his time. He faced up to that too. I think we should remember him. And there is a county named after him, Illinois. There is that mural on the wall of the Capitol. There is a small monument to him, a statue somewhere in the state. But I think he needs to be and should be much better remembered than he is because of the things for which he stood. Oh, my salute to Edward Kohls.
Thank you, Steve. So we're going to go on now to Professor Mcclay. I just want to remind the audience that please pose your questions in the Q&A or via the chat. And what I'll do is I'll try to keep track of them and make sure that we get them answered by the speakers in the Q&A portion of the time today. So next to you, Professor Mcclay.
Thanks, Keith. I did want to make a small correction in your introduction. I'm actually a professor at Hillsdale College now. I'm not at Oklahoma anymore, although I love the place. But one of the reasons I came here was to be a colleague of Paul Ray's. So you see how it all works out. Anyway, I did want the audience to know that I am at Hillsdale College and no longer at the University of Oklahoma. This is a great thing to do, just to pose the question, what is there to celebrate about it? And we're living through a time in which there's such an atmosphere of sort of required criticism, and not just criticism, but condemnation of anything that falls short of the standards of perfection. So what a nice, refreshing break from that kind of threnody of doom to focus on what there is to celebrate. Most of, and this is, I would say, I bet my colleagues would agree, that most of the mistaken view of American history, at least in the classroom, comes from lack of perspective, lack of the larger perspective on human history, which is a dismal tale for the most part. We are living in such an extraordinary era of prosperity, of well-being, of health, nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. We take it for granted that the rest of human history was in kind of continuum with that. It was not. It was not. For the vast number of human beings on the planet, life has been precarious, filled with, at best, drudgery, short lifespans, endemic disease, the sources of which were completely mysterious for the most part, the dangers of childbirth, both to the mother and to surviving or non-surviving infants, high rates of infant mortality. The aroma of death was never far from pre-modern households. The transience and fragility of life lived under the thumb of homicidal maniacs as rulers, and lawless bullies whose authority was based on force, and whose authority was inscribed in the hierarchies of class and status that were unalterable. That they were that into which you were born, and that into which you would live, and that out of which you would die. Your destiny, your very identity was indissolubly and unalterably linked to these fixities. Into the picture comes the American founding, an extraordinary event. in human history. We don't. 1776 should be seen as one of the great moments in all of human history. The founders and framers, the founders of the country, framers of the Constitution, set out to abolish or mitigate as much as possible the very idea of hierarchy. Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's resounding words, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. The Constitution begins with the words, we the people. And we the people were, according to the Declaration and according to the settled view of most Americans, the people were endowed with natural rights, rights that came not from government, not from that structure of hierarchy that we were seeking to abolish, but from nature itself, or nature's God, as Jefferson said. For Jefferson, there wasn't a whole lot of difference, too. There might be for others. So nature and nature's God was the source of the rights of man, not anything that was at the behest or in the whim of tyrants. As a result of this view of human nature, it followed that Americans were people who could govern themselves. They could govern themselves, and that's also in the Declaration. That it's the power of consent, or being ruled under the terms of consent. And Americans were people who could make of themselves not what the thing that they were born into dictated they be, but whatever talents they had and wherever those talents could take. And out of this came what we often forget is the world's oldest Constitution, a document battered mostly by well-meaning, although sometimes rather idiotic attempts to improve it. A brilliant document that enables freedom and enables some of, Steve Balch used one of the great words of the English language, the rambunctious quality of the American people, which we have not been showing in sufficient degree in the last 2 years, in my opinion, as Keith implied in his introductory remarks. The refusal to kneel, what a great phrase, the refusal to kneel, except voluntarily. And that brings me to the second point about America that I think is worthy of notice. So we are a country that has maintained, maybe managed to maintain the importance of religion as a check on human fallibility, even as we have incorporated many of the insights of the Enlightenment about the intelligibility of the world, about rights being grounded in nature and so on. So that, and Tocqueville, among others, is very good on this, on the ways in which Americans kept religion by making it voluntary. Yeah, no one was required to kneel. You could choose to kneel, and you could kneel in the place of your bidding, of your wishes, but no one was required to kneel to a state religion. And I think that Tocqueville would argue that religion, he says religion is the first of our institutions, first of American institutions. And I think in that sense, première means foundational as well as first in time. Third point, America has been open to innovation, to energy, to enterprise, to the ambition of people both within the country who want to rise in the world, and peoples around the world who come here to have a new beginning, to strive to achieve their ambitions, and in the process, they've enriched themselves, sometimes, often, in fact, and they've enriched the nation, both with the wealth that they've generated and with the innovations and example that they've provided to the native born, who often get flabby and forget their blessings. So immigration, very controversial issue right now, but I think fundamentally it should not be. Fundamentally, immigration is one of the keys to Americans continuing a greatness, because immigrants renew our sense of America's promise. That is something they do regularly. Whatever class of society, whatever country they come from, whether it's the professor of foreign languages or the cab driver from Nigeria in New York City, they all have a sense of what America is that sometimes the native born lose. And it's that openness to enterprise and to striving that we have. And we still have it. People still line up to come here. They don't like to come here because they want to see the most racist and deplorable nation on earth firsthand. They do it because of these other things that they know about. I think we should celebrate the generosity of America, both in its acceptance of those come here from abroad and in its enormous philanthropic endeavors at home that dwarf any such arrangements anywhere else in the world. And I think finally, well, not finally, I have two more. Next to last is I think we've made more progress than any country on earth in developing a genuinely multiracial society. We, I think, focus too much on the ways that we fall short of a standard of perfection, which, if we're measured according to a standard of perfection, will always fall short. Every nation will fall. Question always to ask, and we historians try to ask it, is compared to what? Compared to what? And compared to any nation on earth that has attempted the range of multiracial assimilation, we've done awfully well. We've done remarkably well, superlatively well. And I think we should not be discouraged by the ways in which we continue to strive and struggle, because those will give way if we approach them in a spirit of goodwill and with a knowledge of what our past has been. And finally, I think this is a more particular point, but it's something that, when I've traveled in Europe, especially in Italy, where I've spent a lot of time, older people will come up to me just out of the blue and say, "We will never forget what you did for us." And they're talking about the Second World War. There are people who are old enough to remember. The younger people don't, but the older people do. And they know how the younger people appear. And they want to say, "We remember, we know." And in fact, they're right. The United States had a critical role in both of the world in seeing them through to much better outcomes than would otherwise have been the case. Let's just leave it at that. I think one of the values of studying history is for young people to realize that we came much closer edge to the brink of the end of liberty, of the end of all the things that Western civilization has striven to exemplify in 1940 and 1941, particularly the beginning of 1941, when Hitler controlled all of continental Europe. Only the fragile British Isles turned out not to be so fragile. I heard the voice of Winston Churchill rebuking me, but nevertheless, standing against Hitler's unprecedented war machine. And the United States on the sidelines, somewhat, not as much as its citizenry thought we were on the sidelines, but nevertheless, this was a terrifying moment for anybody in possession of the senses. Nothing that we've faced in recent years has compared at all. And we came back from that. We fought our way through it. We pulled the world through it. There's no taking that away from us. So I celebrate that too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Mcclay, and thank you for the correction on your affiliation.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, and so and also thank you so far. Everybody's been staying under 15 minutes. That's I think a record for our webinars. So we'll have more time for Q&A as a result. So again, please pose your questions. Some of the questions are coming in through the chat, and again, you can also add them through the Q&A because I think this is a wonderful opportunity for these three thinkers, scholars, teachers to have a real rich discussion of this very large theme. So with that, on to you, Professor Ray.
I want to address two heroes. who I think are exemplars. They can be put alongside Edward Cole. And I think they exemplify some of the qualities that Bill Mcclay pointed out. Sort of prefacing it, the two people I have in mind are Alexander Hamilton and Henry Lawrence. And I want to touch on certain virtues that are American virtues, and that these two individuals exemplify in a way that is really quite rare. The first is initiative, the second is ingenuity, the third is courage, the fourth is a passion for justice, and the fifth is foresight or prudence. I'm going to emphasize mainly Alexander Hamilton, who I think is the greatest of the American founding fathers. But I also want to say a little bit about Henry Lawrence, who's a man that, like Edward Cole, people don't know about much. Alexander Hamilton was an immigrant. He wasn't born here. And he wasn't born with a silver spoon. He wasn't born to a grand family. He was, as John Adams said in a particularly mean-spirited moment, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, born on the island of St. Kitts. And he might have lived out his life as a kind of household servant. But his abilities were so great that the people in the mercantile community with whom he went to work decided he had to go on to university, and they sent him to King's College in New York, where at the ripe old age of 17, he wrote his first political pamphlet in support of the American Revolution, laying out the first principles of our regime. That he had initiative, good Lord, who had more initiative? He was a self-made man in the most extreme sort of way. As for ingenuity, he was self-taught in almost everything. He didn't spend long at King's College. He found himself on Washington's staff during the Revolutionary War. And during that period, there were long periods when there wasn't much to do. So he spent his time reading figures like Plutarch, the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. And also he read everything he could get his hand on finance. Not just Adam Smith, but everyone else in that period, including Jacques Necker, who was the Minister of Finance in France. And he mastered that so that his understanding of economics was far superior to that of Thomas Jefferson, say, or James Madison. As for courage, he was the hero of the Battle of Yorktown. But he not only possessed physical courage, there was a kind of intellectual courage. He represented a minority position in the American political constellation, and he defended his corner brilliantly. Sense of justice, that's what brings me to Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was the best friend of Alexander Hamilton. He was the son, excuse me, I said Henry Lawrence, I mean John Lawrence. John Lawrence was the best friend of Alexander Hamilton, and he was the son of Henry Lawrence of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, the elder Lawrence was a man of considerable importance. He represented his state in the Continental Congress from very early in 1777, almost to the end of 1779. And from November 1777 to December 1778, he served as that body's presiding officer. Later, he helped negotiate the Peace of Paris. During much of the period of his father's service in the Continental Congress, the younger Lawrence was an aide to George Washington alongside Alexander Hamilton. And with enthusiastic support from Hamilton, he began agitating for the adoption of a program that he hoped would prepare the way for a general emancipation within the United States. Keep in mind, this is the son of the largest slaveholder from South Carolina. During the Revolutionary War, the South proved far more vulnerable to British attack than did the North. The rivers running inland made it easy to land troops in the interior, and the slave population was a potential fifth column. Nowhere was the danger greater than in the Deep South. There, the white manpower was particularly scanty. Moreover, in South Carolina, the blacks were the majority, and in Georgia, they exceeded 2/5 of the total population. In this situation, John Lawrence, with the help of Alexander Hamilton, managed to persuade his father of the propriety of the federal government's purchasing slaves from their masters and promising full emancipation to those willing to enlist as soldiers in the revolutionary struggle. Early in 1779, when the desperate weakness of the Deep South had become evident to all, Henry Lawrence succeeded in convincing not just a few, but all of the delegates to the Continental Congress that his son's proposal had merit, and in due course, John Lawrence was commissioned a lieutenant colonel and dispatched to Charleston to persuade the state assembly to adopt Congress's recommendation and to empower him to raise a corps of slave soldiers. The young Lawrence made two concerted attempts to persuade his fellow South Carolinians, one in 1779 and the other in 1782. On each occasion, he enjoyed the vigorous support of the Pennsylvania-born physician and future historian David Ramsay. But though the military crisis grew more severe with every passing day, Washington's former aide was never able to get as many as 20 of the more than 100 state assemblymen to vote for enlisting even those slaves that had already become public property with the confiscation of the Loyalist estates. In a letter recommending Lawrence and his project to John Jay, Alexander Hamilton had warned that prejudice and self-interest would probably prove an insuperable obstacle. The contempt we have been taught to entertain for the blacks, he remarked, makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience, and an unwillingness to part with property of so valuable a kind will furnish 1,000 arguments to show the impracticability or pernicious tendency of a scheme which requires such sacrifice. And so it transpired. The abject failure of Lawrence's mission says much about the baneful influence exerted in the Deep South at this time by what he called avarice, prejudice, and pusillanimity. Lawrence did not survive the Revolutionary War, and Alexander Hamilton lost his best friend. Hamilton had supported the program in South Carolina because he thought that this would be a way of proving to white people in America that the blacks were their equals, that they could rise to the occasion. It was also a way for a crucial group of African Americans to earn their liberty so that they could be free and be proud that they had established it themselves. It was a remarkable program, and it failed. In the aftermath, Hamilton devoted most of his efforts to an attempt to establish the union of North and South on a firm foundation. And he was persuaded that there were all sorts of divisions in the country that would threaten its unity, but that the greatest division was between free and slave. He wanted to find a way to bridge that unity, to hold it together so that the tensions between the free states and the slave states over the question of slavery would not lead to a breakup of the Union. That was one of the reasons that he said a national debt is a national blessing. Now, he meant a national debt within certain limits. And the point of it all was that this debt would be owned by wealthy Americans, both North and South, who would become stakeholders in the Union by owning part of the national debt. It didn't quite work out that way. The buyers were almost all in the North. But the second thing he wanted to do was to promote manufacturing so that there wouldn't be a world in which the trade that took place was mainly between the American states and Europe, but between the American states in one part of the country and the American states in the rest of the country, so that there would be an integrated economy and the country would grow together in that way. The third reason he was interested in manufacturers and in a national debt that would be paid off regularly, that is to say, it would be sustained, is he was the one founding father, or the greatest of the founding fathers, who knew that war would come, that the Revolutionary War was not the end of it, that there wasn't going to be perpetual peace, that the United States would be involved in wars, and that they would have to borrow again. This is a man who saw much further than Thomas Jefferson, much further than James Madison. And he is one of the least appreciated of the American founding fathers. And I want to salute Lin-Manuel Miranda because he has brought Hamilton to the fore in a way no one has ever done before. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank all three of you. Well, so we have a lot of questions coming in, and I encourage people to continue to share these questions. I'm going to try to go through them somewhat in the order that they've been coming in. And again, let's take advantage of this opportunity. We have another 30 plus minutes with our panelists here. So let's make sure to really make the most of it. So one question that came in, which I think really all three of you can speak to, though it was addressed to Dr. Balch, is to what extent is the concept of an extended republic, one that includes many factions, important to the formation of the republic? And I would guess I would kind of force the question forward into the present and future, since the topic of whether you call it partisanship or polarity, polarization, the like, is one that seems reflexively to be treated as a bad thing. And yet, obviously, in studying Hamilton's work, Federalist Papers generally, and the growth and course of American history, might also be seen as part of its vitality. So I guess as compared to, again, picking up on Steve's theme, the Republican ideal in more pre-modern settings of a small enclosed and more homogeneous state. So thoughts, Steve, and then Professor Mcclay and Professor Ray on the subject of the extended republic and how important that is with its factionalism to the American story.
So prior to the American founding, virtually every republic had been small scale. Even the Swiss Confederation, which took up a fair amount of territory, was based on these devolved localities, towns and cantons and things like that. And it was hard to imagine how you could have much popular input into a republic if it was going to be large. Now, the United States seems to have solved that problem fairly well. And now you look around the globe and you find a great many other countries that have free or tolerably free institutions and are republics or constitutional monarchies, virtually the same thing, and are quite extensive. I think the real problem has turned out to be not so much geography, which we seem to have solved with some help from technology, but rather the size of government, the number of things government does. If government is very big, if it has lots and lots of functions, it loses its transparency. And so it becomes very difficult for people to understand what's going on within it and hold the folks who are running it accountable. In fact, it even becomes difficult for the people who are running it to know what is happening within it. You get the phenomenon of the deep state, the kind of permanent bureaucratic state. So, the United States had a wonderful run. I hope that run continues, but 250 years of survival is nothing to sniff at. And during the 19th century, when government was relatively small, I think popular participation had much greater impact on policy than it does now. So I think we want to kind of re-examine or rephrase what the threat is. I don't think it's extension geographically. I think it's the size and scope of government that's the real threat to republicanism.
Thanks, Steve. Professor Mcclay.
Yeah, I think what Steve says is very helpful. I mean, of course, there's James Madison. This language comes from Madison's Federalist Number 10, and extending the sphere would mitigate some of the kind of factionalism that tended to tear apart smaller republics. And he was really making an argument against Montesquieu, Aristotle, and others who insisted that the size matters, and that the size of the republic was intrinsic to its republicanism, that beyond a certain point, it ceased to be a republican. And, I think the wisdom of our Constitution sort of stands and falls on the idea that the factions, whatever that means, whether it means political parties, whether this means interest groups, whatever can be taken to mean, cannot be eliminated, just the same as the elimination of oxygen is not the solution to eliminating the problem of fire, at least if we're thinking of a society in those terms. It can be channeled, it can be controlled, it can actually be redirected in ways that work towards the public good. There's a whole tradition of early modern and modern ideas about this, about turning the energies of private interest to public good. And I think the Constitution is one in that. I like to compare it to an internal combustion engine. And the explosions in the cylinders don't just produce random chaos. They move the pistons in the cylinders, and they move the vehicle forward, properly channeled, properly harnessed. So that's, I think, the idea that a sort of unitary republic with homogeneous ideas, homogeneous values, is one of the things that this view of the extended republic, I think implicitly it rejects, doesn't it? Explicitly, but implicitly rejects it. And I think, I'd like Steve, I think this has been really quite successful so far. There's no guarantee it will continue to be successful. The framers and founders, and George Washington in his first inaugural address echoes this, that they understood this to be an experiment. They used the word experiment to describe this idea of an extended republic. It wasn't really until Lincoln came around. In my Lyceum speech, he says it's a successful experiment. Now the problem is we forget about the heroic deeds of the founders and cease to obey the laws. But I think that the idea that the republic be founded on kind of unitary cultural values is one of the things that we've embraced, a kind of pluralism as the national ethos.
Professor Ray, you've written a bit on republicanism, but you spoke today about two heroes, so I'm interested in the connection between those two.
Well, let me go back to the question that was posed.
Mm-hmm.
The ancient Greek Republic, and arguably the Roman Republic as well, was founded on the principle of giving to every citizen the same opinions, passions, and interests. They gave them the same opinions because all of those republics were religious communities with a single religion, which is to say the civic religion. So they aimed at a kind of economic simplicity. And it didn't work very well. It exploded on them. And Rome did very well, but ended up as a dictatorship or as a tyranny. Athens lost to Sparta, and then Sparta made a hash of things in the aftermath. So the Americans were trying to improve upon that, and they were obviously dealing with a situation really quite different, which is to say diversity of religion. And I start with religion because that's where their thinking about diversity began. James Madison, who wrote Federalist Number 10, is from Virginia, and he had ushered through Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom through the Virginia Assembly. And he discovered that the strongest support of it came from people who expected to be in the minority, which turned out to be large numbers of people because it looked as if the Episcopalians were going to lose control to the Methodists and the Baptists and the Quakers and on and on. And he brought that principle to his thinking about the national government, which was on a larger scale, and then extended it to economic questions. There's one way, however, in which the extended republic, if you look at it from the perspective of the founders, failed. Alexander Hamilton had grave misgivings about the Louisiana Purchase. He had grave misgivings about extension further to the West. He thought that it would exacerbate the tension between North and South, and by golly, that's what it did. So it's worth keeping that in mind. It has worked very well since the Civil War. And the only thing that seems to threaten it in our own time is an attempt to enforce unanimity in opinion. This is recent. It's only in the last few years that we've seen it. But there's beginning to be a kind of persecution of dissent. And dissent was central to American life. We were the dissenters of dissenters, as Edmund Burke once observed, both in religion and in other things. And there seems to be an intolerance of that variety. And a really powerful desire by corporate elites, by academic administrations, by one of the two parties in Congress, to impose a kind of intellectual uniformity in the country. That could be because we are too well integrated now, and the diversity is not nearly as great as it was. And there is a kind of class, a credentialed elite that sees itself as the natural rulers. Let me leave it at that.
Well, leave it at that, although I think that your point about this threat actually picks up on something that a number of people have posed questions around. So maybe I'll ask Steve and Bill to speak to this as well. But the basic question is, what do you see as the greatest threat to the American Republic today? And people have mentioned in the comments or in the questions things such as anti-democratic tendencies of some on the right or cancel culture on the left, a failure to acculturate or assimilate immigrants. And several of you spoke about the importance of immigration to the country's history. So I guess if each of you could maybe spend a moment just reflecting, and then if there's one particular threat that you would single out somewhat in the way that Professor Ray just did about this attempt to enforce unanimity of opinion, maybe you could speak to that. I think people would find that very helpful.
Well, I think,
Steve?
No, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
I think it's the revival of the aristocratic impulse. We've created an indigenous aristocracy. We've given it, unlike most aristocracies of the past, which were backward looking, that's to say they kind of rested on an entitlement based on ancestry. This aristocracy pretends to be forward looking with a kind of pseudo-scientific sensibility. They have a superior understanding. They recognize all kinds of entrenched evils that in many cases were never seen before, let alone addressed. and they have the virtue and the wisdom to remedy these evils, and other people have to stand down. And if they don't, there's something deeply wrong with them. They're part of the problem. I think that attitude has been nurtured in our schools. Clearly, it's an attitude that comes naturally, given human nature, to people who, in one way or another, rise to the socioeconomic top. But it was combated by the American egalitarian tradition for a very long time, and combated too by religious sentiments that in the United States argued strongly against it. And our education system has expunged those, or helped to, and has brought forward this new kind of aristocratic entitlement. And I think that's really the danger and it's taken over most of the major institutions. So that's, I would say, the danger that we now face.
So the revival of the aristocratic impulse. So Professor Mcclay, would you like to speak to this question?
I agree with a lot of what both of these gentlemen have said, and I'm especially just picking up on Steve. I think one of the things, I don't know that you quite said this, but I know you think this. I suspect you think this, that one of the things that's really insidious about our new elite is that it pretends to be, and I think actually in many cases believes itself to be meritocratic. That is, that because there's a whole system of testing and of educational institutions that form them, which are technically open to anyone, but not really. And I could explain that at greater length, but it's a way of convincing those who have been born on third base and thought they hit a triple, that they actually did hit a triple. They really aren't. They aren't advantaged. So that there's a kind of arrogance that comes with it, a kind of lack of noblesse oblige that the older aristocracy had, reinforced, of course, by religion, which is something notably absent from our new elites. But I would point to something else. I think that in some ways, the unanimity that Paul is talking about and the attempt to force unanimity to manufacture consent, as Noam Chomsky said. I never thought I'd live to see the day I would quote Noam Chomsky approvingly, but that's a big problem, and you were seeing it in the discussion about Twitter, right? So I really resent even having discussed Twitter. That it seems to be sub-cretinous form of communication, but there it is. But I also think that identity politics, the notion that we are fundamentally our skins, or our our ethnic, racial, sexual, and et cetera, identity, these things that are actually, we used to say immutable, but now with the sexual identity, it's triumphantly mutable, and obedient only to the will of the possessor of the organism that that claims this identity. It's deadly to, among other things, to the American idea. The American idea, which is that we, along with other things like the notion of equity taking the place of equality, it's death to the idea that in a necessarily imperfect way, we all begin with what we are, and have the opportunity to raise ourselves in the world. So of course we don't all have the same opportunity. We should try to equalize that as best we can without violating the liberties that do exist. That's not easy, but the alternative is much, much worse, and that is to sort of manufacture equality the way the Soviet Union, by making us all equally desperate. So I think that's and this is not a contradiction here, that a new aristocracy that would seek to impose conformity through a population that is driven by non-discussable, non-negotiable differences based on these artificial notions, many of which they insist on being seen as constructs. Race is a construct, but damn it, we've got to build everything around it. these contradictions actually work together very well and very badly.
So I jumped off of your comments, Professor Ray, on this question. Did you want to add anything briefly on this question of the greatest threat, or that was sufficient?
No, that my colleagues have spoken eloquently on the subject.
Wonderful. Well, so I want to turn to another set of questions that listeners have posed, which really goes to, I suspect, your own sense of identity, if I can use that word, as teachers. And really the questions center around how can as a teacher balance, in my words, telling the truth about American history and some of its ugly truths, with what our theme is today of celebrating American history. And so I guess it'd be really, I think, wonderful to hear from each of you as experienced, thoughtful teachers, how you do that.
Well, look, you got to understand something. I teach at Hillsdale College. This is an oasis in the world of the academy. I never think at all about what might happen to me if I said a certain thing in class. So I can play devil's advocate and take virtually any side on any issue and argue it in order to elicit from students thinking on the subject. And so what does one do at class about the sort of imperfections of American society? And the answer is the proper thing to do is to admit that we're far from perfect, and that we probably will never reach perfection. What distinguishes this country is its aspiration. And those aspirations have been there from the beginning. They're embodied in the Declaration of Independence. It isn't shocking that we don't fully live up to it. This isn't utopia. It's never going to be. It's going to be a nation of human beings who are, as my students would put it, sinful. And I say sinful because my students are mostly religious. They understand the fall. They understand our sinful character. They understand that it's a struggle for each individual to live up to the standards, and that we often fall short. The key question is, do we have appropriate standards? And can we make some progress in living up to them? So, pointing to the good and the bad, it's just part of the task of trying to understand what's going on.
Thank you. Professor
Can
Mcclay?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well put, and I don't know if I can improve on it, but I'll just add something. I think about this in terms of someone you love, whether it's your father, mother, brother, a friend, whatever. Are they perfect? No. If you're delivering their funeral eulogy, do you present them as being perfect? No, I don't think so. You do weigh, or maybe you're writing an obituary, not an eulogy. That's a better example. You weigh some of the things that we're wanting in their character. You don't want to prettify them. And if you sum up a life, do you say, well, that there were these minuses and therefore that cancels the whole thing? Of course not. And I think your question really was about how do we balance, right? How do we balance these things? And I think a lot of it has to do with especially looking at our country. I say in the book I wrote, the textbook I wrote that was mentioned, I can't claim to feel neutral about my country. I can't feel neutral about my father, whatever. I can be objective or strive for objectivity and sort of point to the negatives as well as the positives, but they're embedded in, there's nothing incompatible between love and criticism. In fact, I think those two things enable one another. So I don't actually think there's a problem unless you take it upon yourself, one takes it upon oneself to render a kind of final judgment. America, yes or no? And that is not only stupid, but it is very contrary to the spirit of history. Herbert Butterfield, the great British historian, said that the historian should be a recording angel and not a hanging judge. I think that the hanging judges of our times, the decision we must pull down a statue of George Washington because he owned slaves, or Abraham Lincoln because he wasn't an abolitionist, or on and on, Frederick Douglass because he wasn't sufficiently supportive of women. This is idiocy. It's just moral idiocy because, and I'm going to quote one of Paul's students and my students too. We can quote from the Bible: "The measure you give is the measure you see." And if you look at our time through the same straight moral calipers that so many of the moral authorities of our would-be moral authorities of our time do, we don't come off very well. We live awash in economic prosperity and consumer goods produced by the most horrendous slave regime, arguably, in human history. And we play patty cake with them. If there's any history being written in the future, how will we look? 1619 doesn't look so bad by comparison to that. So the measure you give is the measure you will receive. If we could be generous to the past, maybe the future will be generous to us.
Well, I think our hanging judges are Jacobins sitting on a revolutionary tribunal, or commissars holding court with this portrait of Stalin behind them. They're not disinterested arbiters. When Bill began his first statement and talked about the human condition and how far we've come, that really has to be the standard. And by that standard, America's one hell of a success. And I don't think a balanced presentation of the American present and the American past need pull its punches on that. I also think with respect to education that it's important what level of education you're talking about. If you're talking about the early school years, the primary grades, even middle grades, education there has to be done with a view to socialization. People have to be formed with a sense that they're part of an American family, and that family is a good family. It has the right principles and the right conduct. Even then, of course, we can admit to some failings, but nonetheless, that's a period in the life of a student when they have to develop an appropriate affect toward the country. Then when you get up into high school and college, you can be more critical. But I think even being critical, a fair-minded treatment of the United States is that it's a miracle. I've always congratulated myself in figuring out when and where to be born. I did that from an early age. I wondered how somebody of such modest talent and personal force could nonetheless live so well. And it's really because of the surrounding environment. So I don't think there's a real problem here. And the folks who are trying to blacken the country's name are doing it out of either ideologically driven fantasy or malice and ignorance. And I wish we could say that to them. Put aside the notions of civility for a moment and really tell them honestly what it is they're doing. They're trashing this great monument of human achievement.
I just want to add that if you compare us to perfection, I've already said this, if you compare us to perfection, we're always going to come out short. And there's something a little too easy about saying, oh, you would balance justice against justice. I think, again, the compared to what question is relevant whenever you're talking about real human beings and the real human past.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a wonderful discussion, which, to pick up a word you use, maybe it suggests that the cultivation and exercise of love is not only not antithetical to history and telling the truth, but actually a prerequisite for doing so at the deepest
like
level. So,
You know, one thing we can do in the classroom is encourage our students to ask the question, what would the founding fathers think about us? You know, we're quick to judge them. How would they judge us? In particular, how would they judge our history, which may be coming to an end, of abortion? I mean, they didn't kill their children. They didn't murder their offspring. How will people think about us? Bill alluded to China and our dependence on essentially slave labor in China. There's something even worse than that going on. And it's been going on now for 50 years.
Either of the two of you wish to respond on Professor Ray's question there of how the founders might view us?
It's a little bit terrifying to contemplate. But the poet Randall Jarrell has a poem somewhere, I don't remember the context of it. He said that, yes, George Washington would have been terrified by the Merritt Parkway, you know, a high-speed road in the New York City area. But we would have been terrified by George Washington. I think there is a shrinkage of character that has occurred. And I think to be confronted with that, by an actual confrontation with the giant of a man, George Washington, would be a real shock to us.
Yeah, that's a wonderful move to conjure up the shades of the founding fathers and ask what they would think of us today. I think among many things that wouldn't be all that great, they would think of us as childish in what we expect from life, and ignorant of human nature, really having forgotten all the hard lessons that they could point to in their own history and in the history of antiquity that they knew so well. I think they'd find us a kind of juvenile and shallow bunch, and probably wonder whether we were still worthy of having a republic.
Well, so now I'm going to ask, and maybe this will be our final question, so you have time to each reflect and respond. The obvious response, which is we've spent an hour and 20 minutes celebrating American history, and now we are ending on the note of that we are the epigones of American history, that it has resulted in these men without chests who may not deserve to keep this republic. So what happened? And I guess one way that I was thinking about this question as you were speaking earlier was actually when Professor Mcclay brought up the Second World War and early 1941, that Churchill's own comment about the famous comment about the RAF, that never have so many owed so much to so few, that the cultivation of the virtues, cultivation of virtue is something that, well, if you face it in a kind of hard-boiled way, really does belong to the few, right? And so how do we reconcile that with our praise of democracy, our celebration of this extended republic, and our own our own misgivings at the smallness, as the three of you were saying, of our present day men and women?
Well, I think if we're failing, it's not because of the commonality. It's primarily because of our elites and the sort of educations that they have received. On the other hand, I think the framers probably would be surprised, and I'm not suggesting that we're at the end of American history, though maybe that's true, as we've noted. But I think the framers would be surprised how long a run their handiwork had. If 250 years is a lot of time for the survival of a particular regime. And I think America, whatever the future holds, America has been a success in being able to deliver so much for as long as it has. I hope it continues, but I think we can also already account what the founding fathers left us as a tremendous constructive and enduring achievement.
Keith, one of the things
oh.
that I think occasions the current discontents is we don't really face any real challenges. I'm struck when I think back, I'm 73 years old. When I think back over the course of my life, I'm struck at how successful we were in the Cold War.
Mhm.
I can't think of a similar confrontation between two great powers, each with a large set of allies, that continued for a half century or more, that ended in the defeat of one of the two coalitions and literally the dismantlement of the other great power without there being tremendous, massive bloodshed. It's the greatest example of statesmanship I can think of, other than perhaps the American founding itself. So the generation that fought World War II and went on to fight the Cold War, they really rose to the occasion. And I think part of our difficulties over the last 30 years have arisen from the fact that we've been living with an illusion. And the illusion is that Never Never Land has arrived. That there's a world without war and a world without challenges. In response to that, we've invented imaginary challenges. And all of the great issues of our time are, in a way, imaginary. Global warming. The climate has a whole lot more to do with the sun than it has to do with anything that we do. The sun is unpredictable, at least by us. When I was young in 1970, people were bleating about global cooling. Now they're bleating about global warming. And even if there is global warming and human beings have something to do with it, it's not going to be stopped. To build a politics around something that you can't really do anything about because it is a worldwide problem, and if other populations are going to even approach our level of prosperity, and we hope they will, they are going to contribute more to the changes in the atmosphere that supposedly produce global warming. And of course, it's something that is costless to those people who argue for it. The penalty is to be imposed upon other people. That period of Never Never Land may have come to an end. Vladimir Putin he's certainly not done the Ukrainian people any favor, but he may have done the American people and the German people and the French people and the Belgian people and the British people a very great favor by reminding them that this isn't a world without war, and there never will be a world without war. And we have to conduct ourselves prudently in this world.
Thank you. Professor Mcclay?
Well, I especially would concur with Paul Ray's concluding remarks. It reminds me of the psychologist T.G. Jung once said something I think very wise. He said, neurosis is a substitute for genuine suffering. And roll that around in your mouth a little bit. Neurosis is a substitute for genuine suffering. All kinds of implications of that, one of which is that genuine suffering is sort of part of the human condition, may even be part of our health in some way, weird way, that it's a kind of intelligence feedback system connecting us to reality, which we have a generation around us that thinks that you can tweet your way and use sort of the instrumentalities of digitization to kind of create a reality. That reality is fungible, just as our bodies are infinitely mutable. This is all a vast, neurotic, maybe even psychotic delusion that is about to crumble to the ill effects on all of us. But what I think, I'm a little bit of a dissident on the subject of virtue, because I think that, and I think I've seen it happen, that yes, Aristotle is right up to a point about virtue being the product of habituation, which therefore means that, I think, as you said, Keith, it's ultimately going to be possession of the few. But I think that virtue, and I think I've seen it happen, that virtue can arise in the most unpropitious circumstances, because, particularly in men and young men, I still see, no matter how revoltingly decadent their lives may be or aimless, there's something in there. There's something in them, the desire to be a hero, to be a man, to do the manly thing. You see it in the amazing advertising that the Marine Corps does for themselves, where they conjure up the image of the knight errant. And I'm telling you, this has an effect even on the most tattooed, body pierced, incorrigible bugs that you run into in the 7-Eleven. There's something to be tapped in there. There's some there's some quality, a yearning for, if not virtue in the fullest, the arete sense of the word, but of nobility, of noble behavior, of sacrificial behavior, altruism, of wanting to do something and give oneself to something larger than oneself. This is, I think, in our natures. And I don't think even the most decadent society can murder it completely. But what we need, and Paul is exactly right, we need to recognize the proper outlets for it. It's not going to be in designing ever more clever video games that simulate reality in ever more clever ways. It's going to be dealing with the difficulties that are now almost upon us. And I think anybody who has a brain in their head knows that we're in for some very, very harsh economic times, and that I always tell my students, people my age, you should be furious at us because we've created these circumstances. You're going to spend your life unraveling, but thank God we have the students of Hillsdale College to do it.
Right. Well, I think with that, we should probably bring this to a close with that note of hope, whether it comes from Hillsdale or comes from the Marines, the few, the proud, I remind us.
Or the J.D. Vance type people out
right.
there. They're the people I'm rooting for.
Wonderful. Well, I root for all three of you, and also for our audience members who have been with us for the last hour and a half for this really wonderful discussion. As a reminder, this will be posted to YouTube, to the NAS channel. So please, if you missed any of it, check it out there, share it with your friends, students, others. And again, I want to thank the NAS staff for organizing this series over the last many months, and thank especially our three speakers and panelists today for joining us, sharing your wit and wisdom, and